In 1854, St. Paul-based territorial legislators almost passed a so-called black law. The bill would have required African Americans arriving in Minnesota to post a bond of several $100s to guarantee good conduct. Intolerant Northerners weren't the only problem. In the mid-1850s, Southern settlers tried but failed to establish plantations, complete with slaves, here in Minnesota. After several attempts, a referendum was finally passed, granting the right to vote to Minnesota's African Americans. This was in 1868, 2 years before the nation would take this step with the 15th Amendment. This Minnesota milestone was celebrated with a grand event in St. Paul, where Ralph Gray read Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
The police killing of George Floyd is the latest manifestation of the concept known as the Minnesota paradox. Despite having one of the highest life expectancies and per capita incomes overall, the Twin Cities metro area is home to some of the largest racial inequities in the country. According to data collected by the Star Tribune last year, Minnesota ranks among the worst when it comes to gaps in poverty and home ownership, unemployment, earnings, and education. Earlier, my colleague Tanya Rivero spoke with Samuel Myers Jr., who coined the idea of the Minnesota paradox. He is a professor of human relations and social justice at the University of Minnesota.
Let me begin by clarifying the nature of the Minnesota paradox. So the issue is that there's wide racial disparities in virtually every socioeconomic indicator. But it's not necessarily because of the poor performance of African Americans. Rather, it's because of the substantial position of whites in the country. So that means that in the instance of earnings disparities, income disparities, and home ownership disparities, the values for whites are so much higher than they are for whites elsewhere in the country. And in many instances, the values for blacks are about the same as blacks elsewhere in the country. And that produces a huge racial gap. And many people have misunderstood this as meaning there's something wrong with black people. There's nothing wrong with black people. Rather, white people have a substantial advantage in Minnesota.
And so why is that? Why in the Twin Cities and Minnesota as a whole are there such substantial advantages for whites as opposed to blacks, even more so than in other regions of the country, it seems?
In a village near the confluence of Lake Superior and the St. Louis River, an Ojibwe woman married Pierre Banga, a black fur trader. Their children, including son George Banga, born around 1802, would be the first known people of African ancestry born in Minnesota. In the early 1800s, the fur trade was the heartbeat of the heartland. Along with the fur-trapping Native Americans and the fur companies, there were the legendary voyageurs.
Engagés, voyageurs, were basically the truck drivers of the fur trade. They paddled the canoes, they hauled the goods, they built the posts, they did the hunting, they did all the labor.
Known for songs as colorful as their dress, the voyageurs drove the area's culture and commerce. After attending school in Montreal, George Banga began work in the fur trade like his father, Pierre Banga, and his grandfather, Jean Banga, before him.
He knew how to get around in the country, where the best routes were, where you could portage from one place to another, where a good place for a post would be.
He was a huge man, I mean, big, by even contemporary standards, and a powerful man.
There's one account that he portaged 700 pounds. They were human machines, and men who were strong, who put up with hardships day in and day out, were valued. And most of them wore out pretty fast. It was a lifestyle that used people up.
But not Bonga, although his longevity in the business was due to more than just brute strength.
He had to be somewhat of an intellect. One, he was very skilled in languages. He was educated in Montreal. So he did not come to the frontier without skills, without intellectual attributes. He was an entrepreneur as well.
In 1838, George Bonga received his license to trade. As a trader clerk for the American Fur Company, Bonga eventually ran a post on Leech Lake, where he would have a home for the rest of his life. The experience of the French Indian Métis and the few early black settlers suggests that, in these early days of Minnesota, race was often irrelevant.
This was the frontier, which meant the survival was key. And in a frontier, you don't have the luxury to discriminate. And so it was possible to find all kinds of roles that black people could fill and all kinds of identities that they could acquire for themselves.
Native people identified anybody who didn't live in their way, whether they're Dakota or Ojibwa people, as white people. Bonga's part of that in his work as a trader. He and another man claimed to have been the first two white men in the country in the area they were trading with the Ojibwa, but not as a white man racially, but as a participant in European culture.
So the notion of color and race is fluid.
George Bonga knew Ojibwa. His mother was Ojibwa, he had an Ojibwa wife.
George, like his brother Stephen, used this multicultural background to work as a diplomat translator. Both the Bonga brothers' signatures can be found on major treaties between the United States and sovereign tribes.
And that's no easy place to be, because you had to be trusted by both sides.
Bonga's Cultural Balancing Act did strain his relations with his mother's people. In 1837, the trading post of William Atkins was robbed. Atkins' son was killed in the raid. A member of the pillager Ojibwe was the prime suspect. George Bonga tracked the accused killer through the Minnesota winter for days. He finally captured the suspect and brought him to the authorities at Fort Snelling. After his return to his trading post on Leech Lake, Bonga mentioned the tension he encountered.
The Indians say, if Chigawaskung is missing, they will set fire to my store and break my canoes for my part. I don't think they are really in earnest in these words.
Despite this, Bonga's standing with the Ojibwe remained good. He eventually started a family at Leech Lake.
George married into the Leech Lake band. He took a wife from the Anigam community here. He accepted them. They accepted him.
We find in history there was a certain element of trust that seemed to exist between Native peoples and people of African descent.
The black pioneer gained the respect of many of Minnesota's white founding fathers, and Elder Bonga used his legendary status to advocate for Native Americans who were being pushed further into the realm of the reservation. In the late 1860s, letters he wrote to government officials revealed his contempt for corrupt government Indian agents.
Respected Sir, I am really sorry to have to say that I have lost all hopes in Major Clark. It is a disgrace to the government to have such an agent. I have not hesitated to make known to you my opinion in the matter of great importance to the Indians and the people of the frontier. Hoping that the Great Spirit will so guide our ways that we may meet again and have another good campfire talk, I remain yours, George Bonga.
I mean, he was a man of substance.
He was one of the forefathers of the state, one of the pioneers.
Bonga died at Leech Lake in 1874. He and his siblings had several children who continued to have experiences that spoke to their unique heritage. George's daughter Susie Bonga had been a rising leader among the Ojibwe women of Leech Lake. But white racism towards blacks began to influence some Native Americans, which presented obstacles for Susie Bonga.
The black race has, for more than a century, been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and they have no rights which the white man is bound to respect.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me.
Dred Scott was born into slavery in Virginia. His long struggle for freedom was one link in a chain of events that would eventually free more than 4 million enslaved people. Purchased in a Missouri slave market by Army Dr. John Emerson, Scott was brought to Fort Snelling in 1836 by way of Fort Armstrong in Illinois. When the frontier moved west, Fort Armstrong was no longer needed, so the entire infantry, including Dr. Emerson, was transferred to Fort Snelling.
The slaves in Minnesota were different than the slaves in the South. They made the beds, they made the food, and did the things that the people who were officers couldn't do for themselves.
I think we see Dred Scott more as a personal manservant, or like a butler or steward. Anything that Dr. Emerson needed, Dred was going to be taking care of that. But it is a very different culture than Virginia. He may have seen this as the lesser of two evils.
And when he came to Fort Snelling, there was already a young girl, slave, Harriet, owned, if she could be owned, in free territory by Major Lawrence Tolliver. Major Tolliver was leaving for the winter, and he wasn't going to take Harriet with him. And the way to leave her there was to leave her married to somebody who was going to be within the protection of the fort's walls.
Scott and his wife Harriet remained at Fort Snelling until 1840. They first sued for their freedom 6 years later.
They were one of at least 300 slaves who had sued for freedom in the St. Louis courts before. The majority of them won because they, like the Scotts, had lived in free territory.
In the midst of dramatic national events, the Missouri State Supreme Court reversed an earlier decision granting Dred and Harriet their freedom.
The case came to the United States Supreme Court after 11 years of litigation. 11 years, the Scotts were in limbo.
The Scotts based their United States Supreme Court case on their residence in lands that were part of the Old Northwest Territory and the 1820 Missouri Compromise, territory where slavery was prohibited. In their landmark 1857 decision, the court declared that Congress had acted unconstitutionally in passing those enactments.
Consider the extent of that. The United States Supreme Court declared that the freedom provision under the Northwest Ordinance was unconstitutional. The Scotts would have no basis to claim their freedom under that.
Further, on a technical matter, in order to get a case into federal court, you had to be a citizen of one of the states. The court, in a 7-2 decision, declared that the Scotts were not citizens of any state.
Not only did Dred and Harriet lose, their slavery be maintained, the secondary dimension of this was that no persons of color, free persons of color as well, were deemed to have any rights that white men were deemed to respect.
In 1863, a young John Hickman was among a community of African Americans escaping slavery on the Mississippi. The Civil War and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation offered freedom to those who could find it. Leading this pilgrimage was John's father, Robert Hickman, a rail-splitting slave preacher from Boone County, Missouri.
Reverend Hickman was taught to read by his master for the purposes of, he felt this call to the ministry.
Hickman's wife and children were slaves on another property. Oral history has it that he traveled without permission to see about his sick child.
It's what any father would do. In doing that, he broke the laws of the state of Missouri in that he was on the road without a pass. And the law stated he had to be lashed.
Now on the run, Hickman and other slaves made their way to Hannibal, Missouri.
And it was in Hannibal that the raft was built. They put it out on the Mississippi in Hannibal. An improbable journey. It's a complete journey of faith.
Adrift on the murky river, the raft was approached by a steamboat. For blacks, the Mississippi represented the extremes of America. Freedom when you could get upriver, the worst of slavery when you were sold downriver.
There were as many ships promising people that slaves that they were going to take them north and then got them down in the hold and took them south.
Fortunately, this ship was on a mission from Minnesota. Packets were steaming up and down the river to fill war-depleted labor ranks in the North Star State. The boat took the family-filled raft in tow. The shores of St. Paul and freedom was in sight. But as they neared the levee, white laborers worried about competition for jobs used angry and intimidating protests to keep the boat from landing. The dock workers showed the ugly face of intolerance, but many welcomed the newcomers, contrasting them to the white mob. Hickman and his followers finally disembarked further upriver, near Fort Snelling.
The story of Blacks in Fergus is a story about the strengths and weaknesses of small-town America and of achieving despite obstacles. The story begins in 1862 when Union troops in Tennessee found a new recruit, an African-American boy named Prince Albert Honeycutt.
He was about 10 years old. He became a mess boy for a man named Captain Compton. And James Compton was originally from Meadville, Pennsylvania.
Prince lived with the captain after the war. When Compton and his family relocated to west central Minnesota, his young black protege came along. In Fergus Falls, they found a town that had been established in the early 1870s when a sawmill was built on the Otter Tail River. Prince quickly found work.
He worked as a teamster. He worked for Henry Page at his flour mill. He was a volunteer firefighter. He started a baseball team called the North Star Club. In 1882, that's when he started his barbershop.
Prince seemed to fit in. It said he even spoke fluent Norwegian, but the small town had plenty of small minds.
Then things took a turn down, and that's because he married a white woman. He married a woman named Lena Marston.
The news of the interracial marriage spread throughout the state, and some reactions were stronger than others.
The girl belongs to a respectable family in this county, and the marriage bells strike upon their ears like a death knell. All's well that ends well, but we fear the principals to this affair will not live long enough to witness the end of this foolish step.
The race violence implied in this threat didn't happen, but ironically and sadly, the letter did predict the couple's short life together. After 4 years of marriage, Lena died in childbirth.
1 year later, he remarried, and this time he married a black woman and had a mother for his children. Her name was Nancy Ann Brown. Prince's daughters both graduated from high school in Fergus Falls and then went up to Moorhead to attend the normal school and became teachers. In 1896, he ran for mayor of Fergus Falls. He did not win the election, but he ran a good campaign. He had a lot of respect.
Prince's leadership would be needed when this small town faced big changes.
We had 18 families, so approximately 85 people, that moved to Fergus Falls in one day.
How did a trainload of black folks from Kentucky end up in Fergus Falls? In 1896, the Grand Army of the Republic had their annual encampment in St. Paul. Men from Fergus saw an opportunity.
There were veterans in Fergus Falls, and they got a bright idea that they would take real estate brochures down to this event and see who they could draw up to Otter Tail County.
Their sales pitch to veterans of the Army's colored troops worked, and African Americans from Kentucky packed up their lives and came north. Unfortunately for the newcomers, the homesteads they were anticipating were less than ideal. Just a few of the families were able to make a living on farms. Most were thrown into the local labor market.
Ads were placed in the paper, if you have any jobs, contact Prince Honeycutt.
Prince Albert Honeycutt went from being the only black in Fergus Falls to playing a part in the town's black population becoming the largest outside the Twin Cities. But like the racist reaction to his first marriage, he saw his hometown's dark side again with the resurgence of the Klan in the 20s.
It's sad and ironic that he had lived long enough to see 2 crosses burned in Fergus Falls. That must have been really disheartening, and he didn't live long after that happened.
Duluth, Minnesota, at the point of Lake Superior, has something horrible in its history. After decades of denial, truth came into view, slowly, like an ore ship approaching the Twin Ports harbor. In 1920, in the midst of a mob of thousands, 3 black men were brutally lynched in downtown Duluth. In the early 20th century, Duluth's economy was being forged at the US Steel plant. In the face of demands from labor, the company leveled the ever-present threat of replacement workers. In this case, blacks from the cotton fields of the South were lured north with good wages. This gave rise to racial tensions in the port town. But in June of 1920, it wasn't steel workers, but circus workers who would be at the center of a racially charged storm. The John Robinson Circus was in town as part of a tour of the Northland. Jimmy Sullivan and Irene Tuscan had spent the evening at the circus. The couple encountered black workers who were loading circus cars. What happened next is not clear. We know now that there was no sexual assault. But a few hours later, Jimmy called the police and reported that Irene had been raped. The Duluth police hauled 6 black circus workers to the city jail on Superior Street. By morning, on June 15th, rumors, hate, and hysteria bred the beginnings of a lynch mob. Among the instigators on the west end of town was Louis Dondino. He and a small band drove a truck throughout the neighborhood brandishing a length of rope to incite residents. The mounting mob tension caught the eye of Ed Nichols. In a city of 100,000, he was one of just 400 African-American residents.
He told me the first words out of his mouth when he saw that headline was, "There's going to be a lynching." He barricaded himself and his family in the home, and he took out a pistol.
Nichols was right to worry. The mob headed east and ominously gathered in front of the police station. By evening, as darkness fell on Duluth, the mob moved on the jailhouse.
The commissioner of public safety, a man named William Murnian, did not want the police to use weapons. In fact, as he is quoted, the commissioner said, "I don't want to see the blood of a single white man shed for these niggers." The police had no power to do anything against this mob.
Some of the men cried. Some prayed. But all they could do was await their fate as the mob broke through walls and then pried at bars. Finally, a deadly sentence fell on 3 of the prisoners: Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee.
As they were brought out of their cell, they were punched, kicked, spit on, and they were taken up the hill. It was a block from the jail. They clearly knew what was going to happen to them. There's a case that is always, I found, poignant and disturbing of a young man. He climbed the light pole in order to get a better look at what was going on, and the mob brought Isaac McGee toward the pole on which he sat at the top, threw a rope to him, and said, "Tie this on over the top." A lot of times I've wished that I hadn't discovered that particular story, because it continues to plague me.
In keeping with the tradition of American lynching, the night was consecrated with a photograph.
This is a striking photo in its horribleness. I mean, these are folks who wanted to get in this picture.
The next day, the nightmarish news would spread.
The New York Times editorialized, the Chicago papers, and there were a number of, and the Duluth paper itself editorialized against the mob activity. But there were papers that supported the mob. The most striking thing to me was a comment by a local citizen. His comment was, "Why all of this fuss? After all, they was just niggers."
This opinion seemed to inform how the legal system would regard the murders. The lynch mob, including ringleader Louis Dondino, was let off easy. Incredibly, and despite clear evidence of innocence, the surviving black circus workers were put through an aggressive trial for rape. Meanwhile, in St. Paul, African-American civic leader Nellie Francis led the successful charge for America's first anti-lynching legislation. But in many ways, this was too little, too late.
There was a fear that was pervasive. People left, and in fact, in Superior, Wisconsin, the handful of black families that lived in Superior at the time of this were ordered out of town. All of them.
This mob of over 100 people marched on an African-American's house in October of 1909 to try to stop this family from moving in. The leading men of Minneapolis, as the newspaper called them, these are not the kind of people who want to be involved in mob violence. And they don't have to, because they have other tools that they can use. And there's this tool that they become aware of. It's called a racial covenant. And so just a few months after this confrontation, you see the first racial covenant appear in a Minneapolis property.
And this is where you first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African blood or descent.
100% of them were aimed at black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism have a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the street, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
When you can covenant entire areas of the city, it makes it off limits. That's pretty powerful. The covenants were first put in 1910. But at that point, developers could start buying up large sections of farmland that had joined the city.
When a developer buys what used to be a farm on the outskirts of town, they buy it, divide it into 6 city lots, and sell the individual lots off. At that point, when they start selling off the individual lots, that's really when the racial covenants kind of injected into the property record.
So people like Samuel Thorpe brothers, could buy this up and just plat it and lay it out as they saw fit and put in covenants. It was a very efficient way of doing this. There's this real estate convention. It's there that J.C. Nichols, who runs the country club estates in Kansas City, gets up and said, a few years ago, I was really hesitant, but now I can't sell a property without them. And Sam Thorpe was certainly there. He was a retiring president. He comes back and in August of 1912, buys up the land that will become Thorpe Brothers Nokomis Terrace. And that is the first fully covenanted edition that I know of. It talks about no colored people or other objectionable types. Mary Greer was a woman who inherited many of the Dorman Edition properties near West River Road. After 1910, she started putting in racial covenants. It will never be sold or transferred or leased or conveyed to anyone who's a Negro. And that goes for people who are living with Negroes or married to Negroes. She adopted that early on. Her first one shows up about 1911 or 12. And you see this all through the teens and 20s with her. And Edmund Walton did the same thing along West River Road. At one point, I think they said he had bought up 437 acres along the river. He had gone in 1910 from sort of surreptitiously putting these covenants in, not recording them. Less than a decade later, he was bragging about them in the newspaper. There was an ad, and he printed the covenant, which shows you how quickly they were accepted.
By kind of de-integrating Minneapolis, which in many ways is what racial covenants are doing, this set the stage and enabled all these subsequent systems of inequality to really take hold.
This very persistent myth that northern cities never had formal segregation. The South had Jim Crow, and look at those signs. Well, racial covenants did the work of Jim Crow in the North, all over the North.
The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining, blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
There are no firm realities behind the close proximity to blackness and your property values going down. That's just not true.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they're linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explained why each area got the ranking it did.
The area around 4th Avenue South, which is called the Old South Side. This was a nice area. It had nice homes. It's the historic African-American neighborhood on the south side of Minneapolis.
This one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green-lined designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That line's from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative. And I think it does speak to the ways that white supremacy have been embedded in really built structures and built environments.
The white neighbors, knowing that the Francis couple was moving in, offered them money to not move into the house. William Francis and his wife Nellie, who is one of my heroes, rejected that and moved in, and as a result faced all kinds of harassment. The Francis family did not live there for very long because shortly after moving in, William T. Francis was appointed to be the consul to Liberia, in effect an ambassador, and so they moved to Africa. It's an example of how even the most prominent of African Americans in Minnesota at the time, who had established contacts with some of the most powerful people in American politics, Nellie herself
had personal audiences with Andrew Carnegie and 3 US presidents, that despite their successes and their influence, could still be exposed to racial animus. So it shows the intensity of property values, the perception of property values and race.
Every house has a history. Some of these stories and secrets are darker than others. In the early 30s, this home on Columbus Avenue in South Minneapolis became a symbol of segregation and discrimination. How did Minneapolis get over this kind of overt racism? Part of the answer's in this house just blocks away. Lena Smith lived here. This house on Fifth Avenue is on the National Register of Historic Places because it was the home of Minnesota's first African-American female lawyer. Despite race and gender bias, Lena Smith emerged as a surprising leader in the fight for civil rights. Lena Olive Smith was born in 1885 in Lawrence, Kansas. When her father died in 1906, Lena, then 21, led her mother and 5 siblings to Minneapolis.
By moving to Minnesota as an educated black woman, she was going to stand out in some sense anyway. And all her life she made choices, I believe, that did make her stand out.
Leaders aren't necessarily born, they're made, and people have to find their path. It seemed very clear to me that she was searching for that path.
In 1915, this journey led Lena to the business of the American dream. From 1910 to 1920, the black population in Minneapolis increased by over 50%. But the growing community had few neighborhoods to call home due to discrimination. Working in real estate would bring Smith face to face with Minnesota's quiet but firm housing segregation. This might have led to Lena's next career move. She enrolled in law school at what would become William Mitchell College of Law. It just so happened that the school was 1 floor above her realty offices in the Plymouth Building on Hennepin Avenue.
She and several men, members of the NAACP, several of them lawyers, went to the Pantages Theater in downtown Minneapolis.
And they would not allow black people to be seated on the main floor. They had to be in the balcony. So Lena Smith, along with 2 other male lawyers, took them to court.
She added a count of assault along with her count of discrimination. I figure that means that someone actually had to lay hands on her to get her out of there. The Pantages Theater changed their policy before the case came to trial.
In 1921, I received my degree, and in that same year was admitted to practice. During my years of practice, I have kept closely in touch with the economic, civil, and social affairs pertaining to the needs of all groups, especially the underprivileged among the Negroes of Minneapolis.
Lena Smith made history as the state's first African-American female attorney. Lena was also a leader. She had always been active in the Minneapolis NAACP. In 1930, she became president. In the summer of 1931, Smith's trademark tenacity would be needed in what would become her most visible battle with the entrenched racism in the Twin Cities.
Arthur and Edith Lee bought a house in Minneapolis a few blocks into what was a white neighborhood, with apparently restrictive covenants that you're not supposed to sell to non-whites. I talked with his daughter, Mary Lee Foreman, who said that many of her parents' friends, their black friends, didn't agree with what they were doing, buying a house in that white neighborhood, because they knew there'd be trouble.
No one wants to live next door to a nigger.
In the early 30s, a U of M grad student interviewed black and white Minnesotans about the incident.
They're lower than us. Let them keep to themselves.
I had sympathy for those white people. He shouldn't have gone there. That's the trouble with these northern Negroes.
It's unfortunate that there's a color line, but it's nobody's fault but God's.
A group from the neighborhood formed and began talks to try to get Lee to sell back his house. Arthur Lee made clear the irony of denying basic rights to a World War I veteran.
Nobody asked me to move out when I was fighting for this country in France. All I want is my home, and I have a right to establish one and live in it.
While the white neighbors negotiated by day, they became an ugly mob at night.
Thousands of white people began demonstrating in front of their little bungalow.
1,000 people. You think about 1,000 people surrounding your home.
A white witness described the dangerous scene.
I had wandered about in the rear of the crowd when one of the Negroes appeared. He was jostled about for a few moments, and the common cry was, "Lynch him." I called to the Negro to keep a stiff upper lip.
The negotiators, the press, and even the Minneapolis mayor all increased the pressure on Lee to leave. Despite his principles, he seemed ready to give in. Backing down in such a high-profile case may have solidified segregation in Minneapolis for years to come.
That's where we stepped in. The trouble with our people is they have always turned their face and run. It's time to change about.
Smith, an acquaintance of the Lees, took over their case and declared her strong stand to the press.
Mr. Lee intends to remain in his present residence. I am president of the Minneapolis branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. We feel the issue goes deeper than his individual case.
Many African Americans opposed Smith's line-in-the-sand stance. There was fear for the safety of the Lees. There was fear that this painfully public case might make open-minded whites less so. But Lena Smith wasn't afraid.
She's counseling something different. They are going to stay, that the police chief was going to have the police begin enforcing public order.
Of course I want peace, but I don't want it at any price.
She would go to Floyd Olson, the governor, and ask him to call out the National Guard if these demonstrations continued. That turned the tide.
She took on that case and she won.
From their New York headquarters, the NAACP applauded her impact on the future. From political participation to challenging police brutality, Lena Smith tirelessly continued to take on injustice in Minnesota.
The 1935 land use planning map used to define which place would get mortgages versus others circled these areas, called them slums, places where the quote-unquote Negroes lived. These are places to avoid, right? So they're going to give you substandard housing and they're going to contain you. Access to affordable housing was a challenge. When you think about the reasons behind the creation of public housing, we had a lot of folks forced to the low-wage sector, right? And you're thinking about what jobs or opportunities that low-income folks of color even had access to at this time. You know, I would argue that with the creation of public housing in 1938, with the Sumner Field homes, became this really interesting iteration of the redesign of space. You have 400 units of public housing, which were segregated at the time, created. In 1953, the City Council of Minneapolis refused to scatter another 1,000 units of public housing outside of the Sumner Field Homes area. And where did these pressures come from? You had both internal conservative politicians and outlying suburban communities coming in saying, not in my neighborhood. And the City Council crumbled under the pressure and then took what was 400 units of public housing to over 1,000 units in less than a decade. They have strategically manufactured urban poverty.
One thing that happened is that we destroyed the Black community by building a highway between St. Paul and Minneapolis. There was a vibrant, very, very, economically endowed community. It's called the Rondo community. We decided to build a federal highway between those two cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. The effect of the destruction of that Black community is that you destroyed wealth, you destroyed home ownership, and you destroyed the vibrancy of what was then an extremely profitable middle-class community.
The black neighborhood used to be bounded by Lexington on the west side, Western perhaps, and maybe a little down toward the Capitol on the east, University on the north, and Selby on the south. This was a very warm and nurturing neighborhood. There were shops all up and down Selby. You wouldn't have to leave this area to buy a suit of clothes or whatever, you know, it was all there. Those resources stayed inside the community because those people weren't welcome to come and spend at other places. So it sort of oiled itself and took care of itself.
You can't look at this neighborhood and not also understand what happened in Rondo. The impacts of a freeway swath cut through a vital African-American neighborhood in St. Paul.
In the 50s and 60s, the notion was, well, I'm a white college-educated man and I know best, and we're going to put the highway where I think it should go, regardless of what you think. You live in old houses, I'm going to tear them down, and you can go find housing somewhere else. The African-American community was essentially powerless in the face of the federal government and the cooperation of the St. Paul city government.
Of building the freeway right through the Rondo neighborhood. That was just terrible.
I had just started driving when they put the freeway through, and that did cleave the neighborhood, and there were lots of different diverse reactions to it. Some people thought, my God, I can get rid of this house finally, to eminent domain. And then there were those who, I remember one gentleman who sat on the porch with a shotgun saying, no, this is mine, I don't want to sell it.
I think the freeway coming through at the location that it did, rather than going north of the Capitol, made a huge difference, was very instrumental in destroying their neighborhood and changing the attitude of the Ramsey Hill neighborhood.
Railroads that keep them well supplied and prosperous have always held more than ordinary interest for me. That explains why I'm in Minneapolis, looking up at the offices of the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway.
You caught it!
The Way, a cutting-edge community center established in a Plymouth Avenue storefront, was at the center of racial issues when a now familiar phrase became part of the American lexicon in the late 60s.
The thing that was being talked about every year was the long, hot summers.
There were 2 consecutive summers that we had disturbances in 66 and 67. And of course, like many communities across Black America, Plymouth Avenue was occupied for a week or 2, at least a week, by American soldiers. We shouldn't forget that.
The accounts vary as to how and why the riots started on those summer nights of the 60s. A young emerging leader from the Way named Harry Spike Moss pointed out that it was the long winters of do-nothing that led to the long, hot summers of violence.
Mr. Davis, how do you size up what happened here last night? Well, first of all, I think we need to clear the air in terms of what actually happened, what precipitated the whole incident and the whole bit. This was not, as was stated, a result of the young people not getting paid by us, which were on NYC. It started because for about 3 weeks now, rumors have been flying around through the power structure, for one, that there was going to be a riot. First it was July 4th, then it was the Saturday after July, and then finally during the Aquatennial Parade. And the people were beginning to build up their forces. For instance, the police department had a riot control training program just Tuesday of this week, in which, in preparation for the parade, since the rumors had it that it was going to be downtown. Now, understanding the emotions of men, especially policemen, who are, on a police force for a number of reasons, and the slightest little thing that would happen would force them into doing something. And this is what happened last night. Two girls got into an argument or a fight. The police, one of the fellows was trying to separate them. The police saw this thing. They were ready, armed, and they started knocking, pushing, hitting people, and they began to retaliate. Okay. I want to know, what do you do when a pregnant girl, a colored girl, is pushed down by a police officer to protect her, to serve, you understand? What do you do when she's pushed down, she's kicked in the stomach, her baby dies? When did that happen? This happened last night. And I believe there's a law, there's a law, there has to be some law against it, or does it just pertain to the white? I mean, I would really like to know, what do? Who do you blame? You can't blame the colored person because he didn't push her down and kick her in the stomach. Do you think this started the disturbances last night? It was explained to you what caused it. The police were so ready and so sure that something was going to happen that it happened. How about last year? The same thing happened last year. Well, I have no comments on last year. I mean, last year was last year. But there was nothing done about it, so this is what happened this year. Sure, there's a solution. They know the solution. All right. They want to lay the blame on the weight. Why? It's because the Negro has a foundation to really try to live as human beings. In Minnesota, it's rough. It's rough. It's really rough.
This statement does seem to capture the sense of disillusionment, the lack of opportunity, education, and jobs at the end of the Civil Rights era. While the outbreaks called needed attention to these issues, they also accelerated the exodus of Jewish residents out of North Minneapolis.
People that owned the businesses on Plymouth Avenue, these people were immigrants. They came with nothing, started with push carts. Most of them were just poor people trying to eke out a living, and they were burnt out.
I think as a community with the labor and liberal roots, community that saw itself as largely progressive, community that understood that it had common cause to make with other marginalized communities, came as quite a shock that Jews were nevertheless identified as on the other side. And I think it makes perfect sense for Jews to be uncomfortable with the fact that the dynamic had something to do with Jews being absorbed into the larger privileged sectors of American society more quickly than African Americans, and perhaps a sense of guilt to some degree about that occurring, but a willingness to benefit from that process in ways that I think African Americans saw frustrating, and perhaps saw more clearly and more starkly than most members of the Jewish community could allow themselves to consider.
And remember this, I don't want to talk about it, it's very significant to know that the police precinct is exactly on Plymouth Avenue where the way was. That's more than symbolic, that's erasure.
So you look at these gaps, and we're talking about the gaps between black and white Minnesotans. When it comes to home ownership, we are 46th out of 50 states. 8th grade math score is 48th. Median household income, we are last. So we are consistently placing last in these large gaps when it comes to education, housing, home ownership, income, a lot of different perspectives.
So this is a relative measure, right?
Absolutely.
It's the gap.
And it's so the gap. And
does
so,
it mean that life for black Minnesotans is worse than in other places?
Right. So here's what it shows you to give you a little perspective on that gap. The values for black Minnesotans aren't necessarily worse than for black people across the country. It's just that white Minnesotans are doing better here. And you talk to a lot of people about why this is. I certainly did. And I ended up talking with a professor, an economist over at the U of M, who has looked at this idea. He calls it the Minnesota paradox, where whites, he says, over time and even now are given sort of different advantages to allow allow that to happen here.
Right.
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 So you even go back
It starts,
to the, right,
yeah, it goes way back.
So it goes
Yeah.
back to the 1800s when a lot of the white immigrants, the white settlers, they were given land here at little cost. And as we know, when you get land, it kind of creates that transmission of wealth that continues on.
So you start with this head start.
Right, exactly. Then there's this idea, we always have sort of this deep egalitarian ideology here in Minnesota. But he argues that it really only goes so far. Not just him, a lot of people have told me this when we were talking about these. For example, something like, we open our arms to refugees, obviously Somali refugees, Hmong refugees, people of color from other states, but sometimes you see that only goes so far.
Heather, I think you've laid out a lot of reasons that sound like things that can't be fixed, right? White people were given property in the 1800s. But the reality is there has been quite a bit of policy that led us in this direction. And you look at the way our interstates have been designed.
Actually.
So some of this stuff can be undone. I worry a little bit about this idea of saying, oh, well, in the 1800s there was an advantage.
With this data set that the Mapping Prejudice team has built, we asked the question, how have racial covenants affected present-day socioeconomic outcomes?
And the results that we find are that covenants were a way to lift the house prices by keeping people of certain races and colors out. What we find is a causal link between covenants in the past and three present-day socioeconomic outcomes. We find that houses that were covenanted in the past have, on average, 15% higher house values today compared to houses that were not covenanted. We also find that covenanted areas have lower African American residents and lower African American home ownership rates compared to areas within Minneapolis that did not have covenants.
A new report lists Minnesota among the worst states in America for racial inequality. The website 24/7 Wall Street listed Minnesota as the second most unequal state in the country behind Wisconsin. It measured gaps between blacks and white residents in areas like unemployment, income, and home ownership. And Jeff, how about Minnesota's education system? How will that play into this?
That's where we have that achievement gap that people know about in this state. The latest numbers from the Minnesota Department of Education found that in grades 3 through 8 and also 10th, the amount of white students who met the standard for reading and math was about double that of black students. So these disparities clearly are beginning at a young age.
All right, Jeff, thank you. Minnesota ranks near the top of many national lists as among the best places to live unless you are African American.
Black Minnesotans have experienced racial disparities for years. How bad is it? We asked Pat Kessler to give it a reality check.
The land of 10,000 lakes ranks near the bottom in the United States for African American racial disparity. Minnesota's long record of economic, educational, and race discrimination exploding into view after the killing of George Floyd. For decades, black families were literally banned from Twin Cities white neighborhoods with real estate covenants like this. Today, only 25% of black families own homes, compared to 76% of white families. Without home equity, black family net worth is 1/10 that of white families. The Twin Cities black family median income, just over $39,000. White families, $82,000. It is Minnesota's shame that African Americans are more likely to live in poverty, less likely to be college ready, and more likely to be targets of force by police. 33% of Twin Cities black children live in poverty, compared to 3.9% of white children. Only 25% of black high school students are college ready, compared to 69% of white students. And 60% of the time Minneapolis police used force in the last 10 years, it was against black citizens.
There were cities all over America that were safe havens for gangsters. Hot Springs, Arkansas, Cicero, Illinois, outside of Chicago. But more than any of those other safe cities was St. Paul. It was estimated that 50% of Minnesotans were involved in making bootleg liquor in those days. The other 50% were buying it from them. This Minnesota area was also well situated to make bootleg liquor, to break the prohibition law. We had a lot of Germans, and Germans know how to make beer. We had more breweries per capita than almost any city in America. When you break the law and make illegal liquor, you need water. You need fresh water. We had the Mississippi River, only a few yards from where we're standing today. And we're very close to the border of Canada. So liquor could be imported and exported over the Canadian border. So as a result, this area was a haven for bootlegging and became a haven for public enemies and gangsters. In the 1930s, virtually every major gangster, kidnapper, and bank robber in America lived and worked within a 3-block radius of where we're standing today. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Alvin Creepy Karpus, all were here. People don't know that. There's no statues of these gangsters, but this was the epicenter of 1930s crime in the era of John Dillinger. Basically, the police in St. Paul at the turn of the century sent the word out to gangsters, bank robbers, kidnappers, come to St. Paul. You can be here. You have to promise not to kill or rob anyone within the city limits of St. Paul, and of course pay a bribe. As long as you're on your good behavior, Mr. John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Creepy Karpus, you are welcome in our city. So the deal between the crooks and the gangsters was tolerated for almost 3 decades.
And unfortunately, this isn't a new phenomenon. This chart shows the racial breakdown of people who've been convicted of felonies since the beginning of the guidelines back in 1981. And so the white portion on this chart is a proportion of our population convicted of felonies who are white. That's the blue portion, I'm sorry. The green bar are the proportion who are black. And you can see that the proportion of people who were black within this population really began to grow and expand in the 1990s.
Good evening. Topping tonight's News 11, a police crackdown on street people in Minneapolis, and our News 11 investigative unit is on hand to bring you the pictures. Today, 12 people were arrested on Hennepin Avenue. Charges against them range from disorderly conduct to the sale of drugs. The sweep, which started Monday, is an attempt by police to reduce the growing number of vagrants and transients on downtown streets, which they say is leading to increased crime. Well, tonight, St. Paul police say they've made a major drug bust, seizing a substantial amount of cocaine, cash, and property believed to be stolen. 7 people were arrested, as News 11's John Stone tells us in an exclusive report.
We can bring him inside.
St. Paul police raided this home at 922 Laurel Avenue tonight as its SWAT team patrolled outside. Inside, they recovered a quarter pound of cocaine, worth up to $10,000 on the street. They also found $18,000 in cash, weapons, and stolen property. Police arrested 1 woman and 6 men who were inside the home. They say they'll be charged with possession of cocaine.
We can take him around the other side. He's not going to fit in.
St. Paul police say it was a significant drug bust. Neighbors say it's a relief, as they've noticed suspicious activity in the home.
The leader of a drug trafficking ring that brought heroin to Minnesota and North Dakota Indian reservations will spend 25 years in prison.
Operation West Side Mows began last December. Authorities got a tip that a man from Rochester, Minnesota, Ricky Osborne, was leading a group called Black Keystone Nation Gang, which distributed substances throughout greater Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. It was a domino effect of arrests after that.
According to Communities United Against Police Brutality, 31 complaints from 30 people have come forward against Sergeant Greg Burstad. Today, Burstad is back on the job after serving a 5-day suspension, a suspension the group says was far too light. Communities United Against Police Brutality released this video obtained from Brooklyn Park Police showing the incident in question. The video shows the suspect putting his hands in the air. The group says Officer Burstad then punched the suspect in the head about 20 times. They believe Burstad should be charged with felony assault.
There is nothing reasonable about battering and beating a man who has already submitted, has already held his hands up, he's surrendered. There is no reasonable use of force in a situation like that whatsoever.
We begin with ABC's Gio Benitez in Minnesota.
Stay with me.
This is Diamond Reynolds streaming live on Facebook from her cell phone just moments after her boyfriend, Philando Castile, was shot by police during a traffic stop over what she says was a broken taillight. She says Castile told the officer he was carrying a licensed gun.
He's licensed to carry.
Would this have happened if those passengers, the driver and the passenger, were white? I don't think it would have. So I'm forced to confront, and I think all of us in Minnesota are forced to confront, that this kind of racism exists, and that it's incumbent upon all of us to vow that we're going to do whatever we can to see that it doesn't happen, it doesn't continue to happen. The people who are gathered outside the governor's residence earlier today, they said that they wanted justice, and I will vow that they will receive justice.
Tonight, police in Minneapolis are bracing for protests after 2 officers were cleared in the fatal shooting of 24-year-old Jamar Clark. Critics said that Clark was handcuffed when he was shot last November, but today the DA made his case, and Jerika Duncan is in Minneapolis.
When did the blood get washed off the sidewalk?
Anger boiled over inside the Hennepin County Courthouse.
The city burns. It's on your hands.
Police body cam footage shows the moment officers Justin Schmidt and Ryan Kelly confronted Thurman Blevins.
Put your hands up! You got a gun, motherfucker!
You can hear Blevins begging officers not to shoot.
Put your hands up! Leave me alone!
Just a few seconds later, they opened fire 14 times. 4 of those shots hit Blevins. He died on the scene.
In order to bring charges against a police officer, the state must be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer's use of deadly force was not authorized.
Hennepin County Attorney Mike Friedman cleared Officer Schmidt and Kelly from wrongdoing Monday. He claims Blevins' disregard for police instructions and his allegedly pointing a gun at officers justified the shooting.
The Department of Justice opened an investigation into Minneapolis police in April following Derek Chauvin's conviction for the murder of George Floyd. The investigation will look at use of force and determine whether the department engages in discriminatory policing.
I can't take that, man. I can't. I'm only on the ground. I'm only on the ground. I'm only on the ground, bro. I'm only on the ground.
Well, tonight, the CDC has pulled its federal COVID-19 testers out of Minnesota. These teams were sent here to visit communities and offer free testing in order to get a clearer picture of COVID's impact. But those testers say they were subjected to racism and intimidation.
I'm with WCCO. Get out of here! Get out of here! Okay. Get out of here! Okay, I'm good.
On Monday, May 25th, Minneapolis police officers respond to a call about a customer using a counterfeit $20 bill. Officers arrive and pull the suspect, 46-year-old George Floyd, from his car, placing him in handcuffs. Minutes later, officers lay Floyd down beside the rear tire of a police car. An officer, later identified as Derek Chauvin, places his knee on Floyd's neck.
Now I'm standing about a block away from where this protest is happening in front of the 3rd Precinct.
The fall of the 3rd Police Precinct during last year's riots was a pivotal moment in Minneapolis.
You've seen the video of the police headquarters being lost. As rioters torched the building, officers were forced to evacuate. For the first time tonight, you'll see video of those final moments as police left before vandals breached the building.
In seemingly quiet moments of May 28, 2020, video shows officers gathered inside the Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct. It's roll call. Here, gas masks and protective gear is on, soon becoming clear this night is different.
Do you guys hear what's going on? The Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety is making us evacuate this building. We are going to go in one huge team. You are not going to make it out the door in twos. You're going to go out the door in singles. You're going to take contact with the person in front of you. They'll probably be gassing out there. You're going to have full gas mask and all your riot gear on.
The clock on the wall shows it's just before 10 at night. Once everyone is accounted for, they head for the door. As they step into the darkness, you can hear the chaos erupting outside the precinct. The officer who recorded the video said officers had spent days being constantly harassed and verbally abused leading up to this moment while people threw things at them. He packed his personal items up earlier in the day. He also told us they had a massive crowd outside of our precinct constantly banging away at our doors and windows with rocks, objects, fireworks. And as they prepared to evacuate, the officers could hear loud crashing and explosion sounds. In writing, he shared he kept one bullet for himself, saying, "I do not want to be beaten to death and be dragged alive through the city streets."
Help him out! Help him out!
Once outside, officers discovered the gate to get out had been jammed closed. The squad had to ram it so they could escape. Officers walked half a mile to a location where a bus would eventually pick them up.
Open the doors! Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up!
The 3rd Precinct of the Minneapolis Police Department, on fire. Nearby businesses ablaze. This is how the night of May 28th unfolded.
The situation remains unchanged outside of the 3rd Precinct. Just a group out there engaged in peaceful activity.
Police scanner audio and footage from outside the precinct provide insight into what happened.
9901 emergency. We got individuals breaching the gate at the 3rd Precinct. We also got people trying to breach the front doors.
The police shoot tear gas from grenade launchers.
They're about to breach the back gate. They're taking heavy rocks.
Heavy rocks. Please air the route that everyone should take.
Southbound. We're going southbound.
Copy. Evacuation route is southbound.
Around 10 p.m., the officers begin evacuating the precinct.
Everybody get garbage! Let's fill the 12 stations with garbage! Burn it!
Airing information citywide. The 3rd Precinct has been compromised.
3rd Precinct is up in flames.
On Friday, one former officer was charged with murder and manslaughter in connection with George Floyd's death.
I'm the keeper of the flame. My torch of love lights his name. Ask no pity, bear my shame. I'm the keeper of the flame. Played with fire and I was burned. Gave a heart, but I was spurned. All this time, how I have yearned just to have my love return. Years have passed by, the spark still remains. True love can't die, it smolders in flame. burning out, and the angels call my name. Dying love will leave no doubt that I'm the keeper of the flame. Years have passed by, the spark still remains. True love can't die, it smolders in flame. When the fire is burning out and the angels call my name, dying love will leave no doubt that I'm the keeper of the flame. Dying love will leave no doubt that I'm the keeper of the flame. Here I am, after so many years, hounded by hatred and trapped by fear. I'm in a box, I've got no place to go. If I follow my mind, I know I slaughter my own. Help me, I'm the prisoner. Won't you hear my plea? I need somebody, yeah, to listen to me. I beg you, brothers and sisters, I'm counting on you, yeah. Black babies in the womb.
What are your thoughts on reparations?
Shackled and bound.
I don't know what that is. Reparations, payment for all the damages and harm that's been done to black people in America. You take a pay cut.
I mean, I have one daughter, but she did softball.
Well, I'm not asking. I'm talking about the federal government paying reparations.
That's tough.
Okay, but if if it could be done.
Makes sense.
Well, you know, Minnesota's really nice people. We have a term to describe it. It's called Minnesota nice. Nice people. And we had policies in the 1970s that people described as being like welfare magnets. So very progressive policies which help to deal with issues of low income and poverty. But we tended to concentrate those dollars in certain places, and we have one zip code in the entire metropolitan area is 55411, which is one of the poorest zip codes in America. And by concentrating all of the expenditures on public housing and on criminal justice in this one zip code, it produced, remember that only 5% of the population in Minnesota is black. It produced some really big disparities.
So I want to ask you, do you think then the progressive policies of Minnesota have failed? Because politically, Minnesota is, of course, often identified as a progressive bastion in the Midwest, from the late Senator Paul Wellstone to Representative Ilhan Omar currently. And Minneapolis's white mayor, in his inauguration speech, said, quote, "We stand on stolen land in a city and state with a long history of attacking and excluding our indigenous and Black communities." So, you know, many would look at that progressive history of elected leaders and would have assumed that, you know, they would have brought about more change. So how do you explain that? Is it a failure of progressive policies?
So progressive policies can sometimes have an adverse effect. If by progressive policies we believe that race doesn't matter, if progressive policies we mean that what we're going to do is we're going to solve the problem of poverty, and that we're going to attempt to erase race from our memory. Here's the problem. If the problem is race, then by redefining it as poverty, you produce a sense of distance. In fact, it gives white people a sense of empowerment to be able to say, we are not racist, and that we don't have a problem with race in Minnesota. And so let's be very careful when we talk about progressive policies in Minnesota to say that sometimes progressives can be just as racist as right-wing people can be.
Protest erupted at the police station there after an officer fatally shot a 20-year-old black man, Daunte Wright, during a traffic stop this afternoon. Over the last few hours, several familiar crowd control munitions, from tear gas to flashbangs, used against those crowds. Police with a neighboring city, Brooklyn Park, say someone shot at the front door of the police department there, shattering the glass door. Several businesses in the area have been looted.